Hi everyone. Just to start this lesson, I want you to jump into the quiz straight away and have a go at answering the first two questions as a bit of a do now. Just looking at how fossils are formed and then also looking at this example here to do with different layers of rock and the fossils within them and how you could compare their age. In today's lesson, we're going to look a bit deeper now into fossils and the age of them, looking at a kind of process of radioactive decay to indicate the age of materials. And then we're going to apply that to some examples of fossils and then finish off just by looking at the key findings from the fossil record. So what it is that we know based on the fossils that have been found. I just included this because I think this guy's really cute. Talking about how we can determine now the actual age of fossils. Not just whether a fossil is younger or older than a different fossil, which is what we looked at in the last lesson. We call this process absolute dating. So if you remember in the last lesson, we looked at relative dating, which is saying that fossils up here are younger than fossils down here because of the way that rock forms. If this is, the surface of the earth, the deeper we go down, the older the fossils will be. Absolute dating is a few different methods that allow us to estimate the actual age of rocks and therefore the fossils inside them. So if you look at this here, if we use these dating methods, we might be able to say with pretty accurate knowledge that the fossils in this layer are 120 million years old. And if we go down to here, they're 140 million years old. We're going to look at this process called radioactive isotope dating. Now you might think, wow, new color, that's fun. What does that mean? So I'm using this kind of yellow color to refer to a scientific method or a process that scientists use, because there will be a few more of these as we go through the rest of Unit 4. So this is a method that allows us to estimate how old rock is by measuring the decay of certain elements. And we're going to go through this. Now, just so you know, this can be a little bit tricky to understand. It might take a couple of watches of this to fully understand it, but we'll go through that now. So the kind of theory behind radioactive isotope dating is that certain elements, for example, carbon or potassium, decay over time. Okay, so over time, they break down. Different elements, again, for example, carbon versus potassium, decay at different rates. And a really important thing here is that scientists know what these rates are. The rate can be measured and, carbon will always decay at the same rate. Potassium will always decay at the same rate. When elements decay, so the original element we call the parent element, they are replaced with a daughter element. So they don't decay and just leave space, they turn into something else. So we're going to look at a very kind of broad example and then we'll get a bit more specific. So in this example, we're going to say that carbon-14, which is just an element that is found a lot in living things. You'll remember we've talked about carbon quite a lot through things like photosynthesis and respiration. So carbon is found in a lot of, well, all living organisms. When it decays, when it breaks down over time, it is replaced by nitrogen. What actually happens is that carbon, this is getting quite chemistry, so you don't necessarily need to know this, but the carbon loses some of its properties and becomes nitrogen. Okay, if we look over here at this graph, we're looking here at being, the original time, the time either when this rock was formed or when this animal died. So up here, this is going to represent the parent element because in the very beginning, it is 100% active or present. That element is 100% there, and then over time it decays. So if we graphed that parent element over time, the amount of that element decreases. The purple is the daughter element. Okay, so in this example, the parent element was carbon-14 and the daughter element is nitrogen. Okay, you'll see that these graphs are kind of exact inverse of each other. So as the parent element decays, the daughter element appears because it is replacing that. That's basically being switched into that. So over time, we have more of that daughter element until eventually it's just that daughter element. It has been 100% replaced. I want you to pause here and just go in and answer question 1 in the quiz. All right, the next level on from this is to understand that dead organisms, fossils, and rock, this includes things like shells, everything, consist of a combination of elements. Okay, everything is just made up of elements. As I said before, the decay happens at a known measurable rate for each element. Okay, so because it happens at a rate that we know and we measure, we can calculate the age of either a dead organism or a fossil or a rock by comparing the amount of the parent element to the amount of the daughter element that is present. I'll go through this in a second, this half-life thing. Okay, so for example, we're going to start here that, again, let's imagine this is carbon. Carbon-14, we have a woolly mammoth that has died, and at the time of its death, there is only carbon-14 because none of it has decayed. Over time, some of that carbon will decay into nitrogen. Okay, so you can see here in the next step, some of these carbons have decayed and have become nitrogen. So we've got a mix here. This term is really, really important, half-life. We'll look at lots of examples of this. A half-life is the term that we use for the amount of time that it takes for half or 50% of the parent element to decay into the daughter element. Okay, so for example, we could say that for a particular element, the half-life is 5,000 years. That means if we measured a mummified woolly mammoth and found that there was 50% carbon in comparison to nitrogen, so there was an equal amount of both of those elements, we could estimate that that mummified organism is around 5,000 years old. Okay, I know this is a very general description. We're going to look at this in a bit more detail in a second, but just go in and have a go at question 2. Okay, so as I said, one half-life is the amount of time it takes for 50% of the parent element to decay. So this here is a half-life because half of the parent isotope, the purple, has been replaced by the green. It's about 50-50 there. Over on here, if we looked at this as a graph, this is the time along the bottom here. Okay, so this, where it says 1, is one half-life. Okay, and at this time, there is half of the parent element present and half of the daughter element present. Where this gets a little bit tricky is when we move on to the second half-life. So let's go down now to 2. We are looking at 50% or half of the amount of element that existed at this half-life. Okay, so we go from 100% here, down here we've got half of the parent element, and now we're looking at half of half. So there's 1/4 of the parent element at the second half-life. And then the same when we go to our third half-life, it would be half of the previous amount, so half of 1/4 is 1/8. And then if we went along to our fourth half-life, it would be half of that previous half-life, which was 1/8, so it would be 1/16. Okay, so as we said up there, in the first half-life, half of the parent element exists. At the second half-life, it's half of half, which is 1/4. The third half-life is half of 1/4, which is 1/8. Okay, so just jump in and have a go at question 3. And just to let you know, there are a few answers in there that are not correct. So you're just selecting one for each of the half-lives that I've given. A really important thing to note here. So like we said, the element decays in kind of an exponential rate, a reverse exponential. So we go from 1/2 to 1/4 to 1/8 to 1/16. It's not a linear thing. It's happening kind of exponentially. But the time of each half-life is constant. So if we use the example again that the half-life for this particular element is 5,000 years, that means that takes 5,000 years. This is 5,000 years. This is 5,000 years. This is 5,000 years. Okay, so the time it takes for half to decay is 5,000 years. The time it takes for only 1/4 to remain is 10,000 years. It's that plus that. For 1/8 to remain, it's 15,000 years. So these stay stable. These decrease by half each time. I've given you an example in question 4 just to test that out. Just a little bit of mental maths involved. Okay, there's 3 main types of radioactive isotope dating that you need to know. You need to know, I'll explain that in a second. So the first one is carbon dating, or carbon-14 dating, to be really specific, is the exact element that we're looking at. As I said, this is found in all living things. So when an animal or a plant or anything dies, it will have carbon in it. It will not have nitrogen in it until the carbon decays into nitrogen. So we call it carbon dating. It decays into nitrogen. The half-life for this particular type of decay is around 5,730 years. You don't need to know that exact number. You should know it's around between 5 and 6,000 years, but you don't need to know that exact number. What you do need to know is that carbon dating can be used to date dead organisms, so things that have been mummified or where some of that tissue still remains in fossils, for up to 50,000 years only. Okay, it cannot be used for something that is 1,000,000 years. The reason for that is that beyond 50,000 years, there's no more carbon left. So if we looked at our kind of graph again, remember our first half-life is 5,000 years, or 5,700 years. Then it's about 10,000, then 15,000, 20,000, 25, 30. At a certain point, the carbon has decayed. It is not there anymore. So we can't say whether that stopped decaying last year or whether that stopped decaying 500,000 years ago. Okay, so it is only used for up to 50,000 years. You'll see in some of the example questions that I give you here, that is required knowledge. Then there are 2 other types of dating that have come up a lot in past exams that can date much, much older. So one of them is called uranium-lead dating. Okay, so uranium decays into lead. The half-life for this decay, so the amount of time it takes for half of that uranium to remain, is 700 million years. Okay, so we are talking huge, huge, huge amounts of time because this decays very, very, very slowly. Again, you don't need to know that number. You don't need to know the half-life. You do need to know that it can be used to date very old rocks and fossils. The other one that you need to know is potassium argon dating. Same principle, potassium, which is the chemical symbol K, decays into argon. The half-life for this is 1.25 billion years. Okay, so the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. So we're talking an incredibly slow rate of decay. Okay, so this is what you need to know when it comes to uranium, lead, and potassium argon dating. It can be used to date rocks and shells and fossils that are found within those rocks between 100,000 and 4.5 billion years. Okay, you'll probably note there's a bit of a gap between those two figures. Technically, anything under 50,000 years is carbon dating. Anything older than that, refer to these types of dating. Usually the exam is, it's not going to say 75,000 to test you, but if it did, go with uranium, lead, or potassium argon dating because carbon dating will not work at that. You can't use that effectively. All right, so jump into question 5 and have a go at that. All right, I've included some past exam questions here. People, like I said, some people take a few goes to understand this. I want you to go in now and have a go at answering questions 6 to 10. Some of them are multiple choice, so I've just put the 4 options in the quiz for you. Some I've given you space to write the answer because they include a bit of short answer. Have a go at them and then come back. There's 2 more brief things I need to go over, and then at the end of this video I'll go through each of these questions and explain them if you really had no idea or you wanted to check your understanding or wanted to check your reasoning for it. So try them first, come back, do the last question in the quiz, and then I'll go over the exam questions. So the fossil record tells us quite a few things, and these are just the kind of basics that you need to know, and we'll come back to this more when we look at human evolution, but things that we know from the fossil record. We know that life began very, very simply and became more complex, and that makes sense. Things get more complex over time. So life began with prokaryotes. Okay, so basically bacteria were the first life. Then single-celled eukaryotes evolved from that. So remembering that they are more complex cells with organelles. So originally it was just those single-celled eukaryotes like amoebas. Then we had some multicellular eukaryotes. Again, we're looking very, very basically here. Things like, yeast, nothing super exciting. Then very simple soft-bodied organisms like these sea blobs. That's not what they're called, but things like that, very soft-bodied, no skeleton or anything like that. And then more complex organisms with exoskeletons, so a skeleton on its outside, like these here. Okay, obviously that's still only bringing us up to very, very basic life forms. From there we got a lot more diversity, which we'll look at in some of the next lessons. The other things that the fossil record tell us, or just a couple of other key findings. Many species that used to exist are now extinct. Okay, key example of that being dinosaurs. Okay, we know that because we have found fossils of these organisms, and humans have reached pretty much every single corner of the world now, and those organisms no longer live. Okay, another key thing, which is almost the opposite of that, is that many extant, so extinct are things that have died out, extant are current living species, for example humans, don't seem to have existed in the past. The reason we know that is that the fossils only go up to a certain date, to a certain time. So for example, and this stuff changes a lot, but for example, the earliest fossils of human ancestors, were a couple of million years ago, and that's not Homo sapiens, that's very previous ancestors. We haven't found any that are 50 million years old. Okay, so that tells us that this change has been occurring. Another key term, and we'll come back to this again in other lessons, is transitional fossils have been found. And these are fossils that show features of ancestral species, so original species, as well as the younger or more evolved species. So examples of that being human ancestors. There are fossils of organisms or species that was kind of somewhere between chimpanzee and human. Okay, so that shows us that this change is occurring. It doesn't just happen overnight that it goes from one species to another. Little changes add up. Okay, so transitional fossils that have been found tell us that this has been happening. And another key thing that I kind of mentioned before, the fossil record is only as good as the fossils that either have been formed, remembering that 99.999% of things that die will not become fossilized. So there could be species that existed that we will never know about because they didn't die in the right conditions that allowed them to be fossilized, or things that have been discovered. Okay, this is still a huge area of research. New fossils are being discovered all the time that give us more and more information. Okay, but these are the things that we do know from all of the fossils that have been found over the last few hundred years. So just go in and answer the final question there. And if you want to go through those exam questions, I will explain them now. So the first one, just a multiple choice, basically is comparing two different types of fossils. The key information here is that in one area we found fossils. It doesn't matter that they're human remains, but just that they were between 10,000 and 4,500 years ago. Okay, so in fossil terms, very, very young. The other fossil we're looking at here was dated to be 110 million years old. Okay, so which types of dating would have been used? Hopefully you are saying carbon dating for this because it's less than 50,000 years old. And then the two options that we've discussed would be uranium lead, or potassium argon could also have been used for this. So if it was a short answer question, you could have used either of those, but obviously this exam question only gave uranium lead as an option, and the answer would be D, carbon dating for the human remains and uranium lead dating for the dinosaur remains, which are much, much, much older. Right, the next question gives us a graph like we've looked at before. It's looking at potassium argon decay, and it tells us here that the half-life for this is 1.3 million years. Okay, so here that is 1.3 million years is one half-life. Okay, this is the second half-life, so it's first half-life, second half-life, third half-life, fourth half-life. A rock was found to have 25% potassium-40 remaining. Okay, 25% is a quarter. So hopefully, you are thinking here that the first half-life would be half of it left, which is 50%. Second half-life is a quarter, which is 25%. So we're looking at the second half-life here, and the approximate age of that rock would be 2.6 million years. Okay, it gives us the number here. So you really just had to identify which half-life we are looking at. And again, this is a really good opportunity to write on your exam paper or on your SAC question, so you're pretty clear about what you're doing there. This question is actually quite kind to you because it actually gives you the percentage change here as well. So you could have traced that along, but you really do need to know that the second half-life would be 1/4 or 25% remaining. All right, Similar question here. This one is looking at a kangaroo skull, and we're looking at carbon dating, so carbon to nitrogen, and it graphs it here. The original question didn't have the A, B, C, D on there. I've added those to make it easier for online, but the question asked you to draw on here. So kangaroo skull is found, the carbon nitrogen ratio is analysed and found to have 1/4 of the carbon remaining. Okay, so again, same thing. We know that the first half-life would have been half of the carbon remaining. The second half-life would be 1/4 remaining. C, just for consistency, would have been 1/8. D would have been 1/16. So part A, for 1 mark, place an X on the curve to show the fossil's carbon to nitrogen ratio. So you would have put an X here, okay? Or on the quiz, you would have indicated B. And then part 2, given the half-life of carbon is approximately 6,000 years, so like I said, you'll generally be given that information. You don't need to remember half-lives. What is the approximate age in years of the kangaroo skull? So we're saying we know it's at this point here. That's 6,000 years-ish. And then the second half-life is another 6,000 years. Remember, that time stays stable. So 6,000 plus 6,000 would be 12,000 years. Okay, these next 2 questions more kind of relate to what we did in the last lesson, just to see if you remember that. So this is showing us 2 rock strata from 2 different sites, site 1 and site 2. Hopefully you're looking at this and realizing that these layers are not the same, okay? These 2 are the same. They've got the same shading, they've got the same fossils in them. So A and E are the same. B and F are the same type of rock. The size is obviously quite different. Then there's this one that there's no corresponding one in site 2. So obviously whatever conditions formed this level of rock didn't exist in that location. And then these 2 are the same. Okay, and then we've got these 2 newer ones over here that didn't exist in location 1. So based on these diagrams, it would be reasonable to conclude that fossils in strata B are the same age as strata E. So are this and this the same? No, they're not. Okay, so that is incorrect. B, strata A are younger than strata E. No, they're the same. So that is incorrect. We've said these are the same type of rock. Strata D, which is this one up here, are younger than strata F. Okay, so we've said this is the same as G, and F is older than G. So that is correct. This is younger than strata F because it is closer to the surface. But we'll just check D. Strata I over here are older than fossils in strata G. No, no way. These are the youngest ones because they are closer to the surface. Okay, so the correct answer is C. And then the final question, often these questions will give you an example. So this is talking about particular caves. The relevant bit of information for this question is here, but we'll come back to that. Part A is, in which layer would you expect to find the oldest group of fossils? So this is the ceiling of the cave. So this is going to be our surface because everything was coming in through the opening in the ceiling. So the deepest rock layer there is 1, and that is where we expect to find the oldest group of fossils. B, sometimes scientists use index fossils to date a rock layer. We looked at these in the last lesson. This said to describe 2 features. So you'd want to give a little bit of information. In the quiz, I gave those 4 possible answers, but this would be things like it is very distinctive in its appearance, so we know it belongs to a certain species, that it was abundant, so lots and lots of them are being found, that they are geographically widespread, have been found all over the world, or that they existed in a relatively short geologic time period. Okay, so any two of those. And then the last one, outline one other method that scientists could use to date the fossils in the oldest layer within the cave. That's where this information is really relevant. It tells us that we're going back to 1.8 million years here. Okay, so there you would need to say either uranium lead dating or potassium argon dating for 1 mark. Okay, and that's today's lesson. Like I said, sometimes it takes a couple of goes at going through this. If you have any questions, obviously reach out and I can go through them again. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time when we get back to school to go over this, but we probably can't spend too much time on this as we will need to move on. All right, thank you.